I'm really thrilled to finish up with another old friend and frequent contributor at some of our past CDX events. For those of you who have been there, and there is Nigel in front of his waterfalls. Yes, Nigel Fenwick. Is a VP and principal analyst on looking at digital transformation. So when I was programming the show, I thought, who better to wrap things up with, and everything we've been sort of talking about the last 2 days than you, Nigel. But why don't you just quickly introduce yourself and give us a little bit of the day in the life of Nigel Fenwick?
Sure. Thanks, Drew. Great to be here. Good to see you. Shame it's not in person.
Yeah, hopefully soon.
This time of day, we'll be having a drink, I'm sure.
Yes.
Day in the life of me. I spend a lot of time looking at how to help firms use technology to grow revenue. Really, fundamentally, is what I consider my job to be. I do spend a lot of time talking to leading digital companies about what they're doing, their experiences, to help inform the research, and advising clients on how to actually apply the research and make changes to their business. So it's all go, and hasn't slowed down in the last 12 months. So
Right. Well, yeah, and that's a good segue. Let's talk about the last 12 months. We all know what's been happening. We've been talking about this for 2 days here and hearing from a lot of different companies and a lot of different businesses, but there are, of course, the common themes. Where it started was sort of ensuring operational resilience, and then there was some fatigue, and then, okay, let's accelerate. I guess the question I'd like to ask is, over the last year, just what bubbles up the top of the mind, like maybe 5 years from now, if you're writing a diary or someone asking you to write your memoir on the year 2020, and the conversations you had with the clients that you work with, and just business in general. What happened in 2020 from your perspective as it relates to business and acceleration, and how's that going to inform where we go moving forward?
Well, a prophecy came true, which you don't normally see it happen quite that well. So I remember in 2013, I started advising clients that basically by 2020, the digital predators would eat the digital prey, and essentially the companies that got it would be well ahead, and the companies that didn't would
Yeah.
be struggling. What I didn't expect to happen was a pandemic that actually just sealed the deal. So it's always nice to be right, but never usually that sweet. So essentially, what we saw in the research, certainly, and it pulled through in the data we got toward the end of 2020, was the advanced companies, the companies that we track and rate as advanced in their digital maturity, really did accelerate out, and they put the pedal to the metal. They really started investing and pushing money into their digital investments in a much different way to the companies that were just beginning in that digital journey. Many of those either froze their budgets or even scaled back budgets. So they were left kind of struggling and scrambling to figure out, well, how do we just get employees working at home, etc., and all that stuff. So it was really a tale of two digital transformations. One was the laggard companies, to call it that, who really had to try and figure out how to operate in a digital world for perhaps much faster than they had planned to do it. Maybe they thought they could take the next 3 or 4 years to do it. Had to try and get everything done in 12 months. And of course, there's a lot of vendors and services firms more than happy to help them do that.
Right.
And then the advanced firms, of course, they're in the position to take advantage of their, a lot of their digital maturity. That they got a lot of the pieces in place to just help deliver value to customers through their digital platforms. And so it was a very good year for them, obviously.
Yes.
So yeah, it definitely saw a difference there. And I think from a point of view of where I see the challenges come out of the market, part of it is differentiation. Like, how do we really get disruptive? So I spend a lot of time now with clients trying to help them figure out how to get to differentiate the digital experiences, how to build disruptive products, and those kind of things. So it's different.
Yeah, and your prediction back in 13 and talking about the digital prey, and I agree with you, and it certainly did come true. And part of that was an explosion of let's say D2C companies and direct to consumer and challenger brands and things like that. Did the pandemic slow that wave at all? I mean, it seems like there were a lot of DTC companies that maybe either went out of business or they had to pivot or they had to scale back their ambitions or whatever it might be. The money was just not sort of flowing as much. Did the pandemic sort of allow for some of the more traditional and legacy companies to catch a breath, and or did it not stop at all? And when we emerge in 2021 and beyond, are these challenger brands going to continue to prey on sort of the legacy laggards, to use some alliteration, I suppose?
Well, I think one of the things we saw is that there's a lot more direct to consumer from the traditional businesses that weren't direct to consumer.
Right.
So B2B companies opening up direct to consumer channels, saw a lot more of that. Companies looking to change their business model, to more platform models, selling more through marketplaces. We saw that accelerate a lot in 2020. So marketplaces is just growing very fast. Does it mean that it's harder for the challenger startups? I don't think so. No, we're going to continue to see startups accelerate and put pressure on the incumbent companies because it's easier to just create a business and go test an idea. As easy as it has ever been. And unless it's a heavily regulated industry, there's very little to stop a company trying to go out and do that. What I have seen is a shift in some cases in the way the larger firms are thinking about the interaction with the startup economy, right? So
right.
How they're actually looking at venture capital, how they're looking at incubation of ideas of either their own or other companies. So all of those things, I'm seeing a lot of shift in that space too.
Yeah, and we've talked a lot about open innovation, and you've joined us at a couple of those conferences as well. What I'm curious is, looking at the companies that, let's say, even pre-pandemic, right? We know, okay, pandemic accelerated all this digital transformation. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. But even before then, what were the traits of the companies that you were working with that were, again, to your core job, using digital technologies to, sort of create new revenue? Maybe it's business model innovation. What were the traits of the companies that were successful at business model innovation, whether they were under pressure to really, really have to do it, or were looking ahead and said, yeah, we have to do it. Maybe the threat's not quite yet, but we're going to do it now.
So business model innovations is a challenge for any company because you kind of essentially trying to disrupt the core business, and for a big company, that's a big challenge. A lot of challenges in that. We'll get onto some of those. The number one trait I would see across any company, and we cover this a lot in the research papers we publish, is just how customer obsessed they are, and it's just hyper focus on what is it the customer's trying to do, what's the outcome they're trying to get to, how can we help them, how can we use technology to help them get to that outcome in a different way,
right?
And it's because they're so focused on the customer and thinking about helping them get to solve a problem, get to an outcome. They don't think of how do we just sell more to the customer. They think of how can we create value for the customer to get to the outcome. And it's that mindset, that empathy for the customer, that distinguishes the companies that kind of get it and the companies that don't, to my mind. And then there's a whole bunch of other things that, if you're building business models, then it depends on the structure and the org structure and the P&L and how you're going to fund it, and whether it's a new product model or a new platform. It says a lot of other things to come in there, but the number one thing is by far being customer obsessed, and it's led by the CEO. The CEO is always driving it, and especially if you're doing business transformation, it's always CEO led.
Yeah, and building a little bit on that and the conversation we were having with Carol, culture transformation. Obviously, none of it works. The CEO can mandate it. That's great, but then it has to. Everyone else has to execute on it, and they have to be on board, right? There's got to be buy-in. So similar question in regards to business model innovation. Give us your thoughts on the traits of the companies that have been able, that you've seen and personally witnessed, without naming them, that have really driven that cultural transformation, and any sort of bits of best practices that have emerged from the many that you have worked with over the years.
Well, cultural transformation is one of the things I looked at, and we did a piece of wave research, we call them,
Yep.
earlier this year, looking at the top 10 vendors that are doing business model transformation with their clients. And culture was part of one of the things that we looked at in terms of how well they're helping clients change that culture. And I have to say, it's one of the things that I think is least accounted for in a transformation. That a lot of firms, they'll focus on the technology, they'll focus on the customer, they'll focus on a lot of other things, even employee metrics, but sometimes they just totally overlook the culture. And that's partly because I think it's very hard to change. If I think about the things that they do well, one is having a real, frank, open assessment from being willing to listen to employees, to let the employees tell you what the culture is actually like, because it's never what the leaders think it is, right? There's this huge
Right.
difference between what the leaders think the culture is and what everybody else says it is. And they say culture is kind of what your employees do when nobody's looking, right? So it's like, you really got to get it from the employees, and then using the employees to help shift the culture. So really embracing it. So not trying to do it top down, because it's almost impossible to do, but listening to the employees, being willing to change the way the leadership team works, empowering employees to be part of that change, looking at metrics, because for the years I've been looking at this, metrics to me is the number one reason why you have organizational dysfunction and cultural problems. Especially in transformation, you look at having teams that are brought together, multifunctional teams. You bring digital teams together with people from engineering, from IT, from marketing, customer experience, and you put them all in one team and say, hey, go change something and make it great. And every single one of those people in those teams have different metrics, and their worldview, their view of the business is driven by the metrics they have, right? And so
Right.
they're thinking, well, I'm measured on this, so this must be what's important. And yet the person they're sitting next to is measured on something completely different. And so everybody approaches a problem from a perspective that is completely different from each other. And until you get everybody unified around a common set of metrics, something around customer impact, customer value, lifetime customer value, you don't get the team really thinking the same way. And to me, that's a core part of the culture. When you have the metrics pulling people in different directions, it's very hard to create a culture that's obsessed around how do we create value for the customer.
Right. And the responsibility of determining the metric. Is that the C-suite? Is that the top down in terms of agreement, or should figuring out that metric also come bottom up? Should that be a sort of a process that involves everybody?
Well, of course, OKRs are really hot right now. So, you can't have a conversation about metrics without OKRs. But if you think about OKRs and the way they're structured, it's very similar to the way, we used to talk about SMART goals and having metrics that are cascading through the organization. The biggest challenge I see around metrics and OKRs is when they cascade through the organization, there's a sense of, okay, we're going to align them to things that are above, right? So as we cascade down, the individual metrics, but they're aligned to something that's above. But, if you go back to thinking about those, like the different roles on a team, and if they don't have the same OKRs, even, regardless of what's above them, if they as a team don't have the same OKRs, they're going to operate in a somewhat dysfunctional way unless they can reconcile those OKRs. And most people on the team don't even know what their peers are measured on in terms of OKRs. So have a conversation. I'm constantly stunned by how many senior executives I talk to don't know what their managers' OKRs are, right? So they don't know how their managers actually measure. Like, how can you help your manager be successful if you don't know how they're measured, right? And it's so this awareness of what metrics are through the organization, how they stack together. Yes, it starts at the top, and it requires, I think, the leadership to have awareness of how they cascade down through the organization and what the impact is of those metrics. And I talked to a CEO once who was, we were talking about metrics, and he said, oh yeah, we have customer metrics. Every board meeting we talk about the customer metrics, and it's really important to us. The most important thing. So that's great, fantastic. Tell me, how often do you talk about customer metrics? How you meet every month, I presume. So like, how often do you talk about it? Oh, we every 6 months we go through the customer metrics and go deep on that. I said, okay. And how often do you talk about revenue and profitability? Oh, we do that every month. It's like, okay, so what's the message you're communicating to everybody about the importance of customers versus revenue and profitability? Like, people do what they're measured on.
Interesting. And please, out there, if you have any questions for Nigel, please put them in the chat string. I'm monitoring here, and we'll get them. I'm always, been the conference thing now for 15 years. So I follow titles closely, and we've had sort of C-level title explosion, I would say, in chief innovation, chief digital, and chief everything. I'm curious about, particularly though, I'm noticing that CDOs are still around. I imagine they'll still be around for a while. They're evolving into CTO positions in some cases. I think a lot of the CDOs are the future COOs and CEOs as well. But it seems like there's a CTO that's sort of, I don't know, re-emerging is the right word, where the CIO is looking a lot at, is still very strategic and increasingly strategic, but that CTO may be in more of the role of the technology roadmap and looking strategically, like, okay, maybe even getting right in there in product development, right? Like, okay, if we're going to develop a product that's going to have a voice application, the CTO is really on the forefront of what's happening with voice and brings in his or her expertise into that conversation. Is the CDO eventually going to go away, and CTOs will kind of be there? Or will the CEOs and the boards feel like they need to still have that CDO there, as a safety blanket, if you will? Not to minimize what CDOs are doing, but you understand the question.
Yeah, try not to upset all those CDOs out there.
No, not intended to do that at all.
So I have seen, let's put it this way: when we started tracking chief digital officers in 2013. About 50% of them back then said they thought this role was temporary. That percentage has gone down. There's been a shift, like earlier on, like towards 2015, 16. I was seeing a lot more CDOs sort of more aligned with marketing. And then I started to see a shift where there's more CDOs aligned with technology. And so I think a lot of CIOs who were being hired were coming in and saying, well, I don't mind coming in as the CIO, but I want the title of Chief Digital Officer because it sounds cooler and nobody wants to be CIO.
Right.
And I think there's certainly been that. And I see a lot of CDOs who are responsible for IT and, digital. So that kind of makes sense to me because it's a natural extension if you've got a business focused CDO who understands technology. The Chief Technology Officer, though, is an interesting one because that's always been around. That's been sometimes just you could flip between a CIO and a CTO. They both do the same job. The key industry that was different is technology industry. In the technology industry, you have a Chief Technology Officer and they're responsible for the product. And so I think as companies build more digital products and they drive revenue out of those digital products, in other words, they become more of a digital business, which is the transformation. Then yes, the CTO is likely to be that. I'd also say you could call that and Chief Digital Product Officer for that matter. It's really a question of what is it going to elevate the role of whoever's senior responsible for the technology, the digital products, into a role that helps them have that seniority in the organization. Because I think the CEO needs to have a senior executive who understands how to build digital products and drive revenue from them, because that's the future of the business.
And I'm assuming that you've also been working more, even directly, or inquiries that come directly from boards, right? I mean, because the digital transformation is now the mandate at the board level too. Have you seen that? And even just in your own consultative sort of experiences, have you found yourself consulting boards as much as C-suite executives?
I wish. No, not yet.
Not yet.
I remember, I do think that the boards get the CEOs they deserve, and CEOs get the executives they deserve. And as boards are becoming more digitally savvy, then they're making sure that they have the right kind of digitally savvy CEO in place to be able to drive the business, understand how to use technology to drive revenue. And then those CEOs are likely to say, you know what, I want to sort out, make sure I've got a digitally savvy CMO, CIO, whatever the name is, Chief People Officer, and the business unit leaders are all really digitally savvy, so that the ability to use technology to drive revenue becomes everybody's job. I mean, that's just business going forward, right? So, I hesitate to call it digital business because it's just business. It's business with technology. It's what it is today. We differentiate it from past business by calling it digital business, but reality is the future is all digital, and so learning how to actually build an executive team around that is really key.
And related to that, Doug Robinson. Hey, Doug, thanks for asking the question. Good old friend there. What are your thoughts on the chief commercial officer role emerging as the one to oversee the CDO, CMO, CSO, CIO? Interestingly, that Jared, not quite at that level, but Jared from the Washington Post just talked about that, where he's the head of commercial, but he has technology under him too. And any thoughts on that with the commercial officer?
Well, you can see it on the commercial officer or the chief operating officer. I mean,
yeah,
I think essentially the chief commercial officer essentially becomes almost the chief product officer at that point, if they've got product reporting to them. I mean, it's essentially the role of the chief commercial officer is marrying the product, the channel, and making sure delivering customer value to drive revenue. Then yeah, that totally makes sense. It's not about any one title in terms of what's right for any one company, because it's about making sure you got the right team in place.
Right.
And really the titles are immaterial.
I agree. So I just often wondered if it's all sort of a conspiracy from like Korn Ferry and Spencer Stewart and all. It's like just
well,
this
that
massive,
could be the case.
massive title explosion. So but anyway, so I want to let you go on this. We do have to wrap up, but how do you stay informed? What do you besides, of course, attending CDX conferences? What do you read? Maybe besides the obvious ones, any interesting blogs or newsletters, or not even related to business. How do you stay informed and motivated and inspired and being able to stay a step ahead?
So I do try and track what's going on in the technology field, like the emerging tech and stuff. So I stay in touch with what the tech vendors are doing. And of course, we get briefings from a lot of the tech vendors, so that's always useful to see. But I'm talking to a lot of vendors about the case studies they're doing with their clients at the leading edge. I'm always pushing them to say, okay, show me what you're doing that's leading edge, where things are going to be going. So yeah, I mean, a lot of the research we're doing is really trying to push the envelope, right? I mean, so I'll often pick up like Harvard or Forbes or whatever it is and just scan through it. And like, yeah, okay, we wrote about this 2 years ago. So it's that bit's a little bit challenging. Reading other research, I like reading other analysis. A lot of really bright people at Forrester, so that's always great, because I do actually read a lot of the stuff we publish. So it's great when you're sitting inside essentially an information business where we're churning out like leading edge research about what companies are doing, because you just have to like go talk to your neighbor or pick up a paper and go figure out what's going on there. Looking at data, we drive a lot of stuff out of data, right? So we're doing massive data surveys every year, and that's really insightful just to see the trends and connect the dots about what's going on. But then Wall Street Journal, I try and keep up to date with what's going on in the newspapers. BBC News I track. BBC Technology's got a great channel as well.
They do.
And so, and social media, I try and, see what people are posting on social media, when I'm not actually sleeping.
No, that's great. Hey, one other question I wanted to get to, just because ultimately this is for our audience and it is a good question, but if you can answer it in like 15 seconds or less, just the offshoring trend we saw for years and years and years, and the problems that are you seeing an return to onshore? Are you seeing an onshoring trend at all from companies who thought that maybe it impacted their customer experience or whatever? Real quickly, do you see
yes
that?
and no. So yes, onshoring on the core capabilities that really differentiate the business, for sure. They're coming on board onshore and in on-prem. But there's still a lot of outsourcing of the less differentiated capabilities for the business, for sure.
Yeah. Oh, and real quickly, they didn't want to ask the question publicly. So what is an OKR? That's another question.
Objectives and key results.
Okay. No, someone asked the question, and so I'm asking it on their behalf.
Okay.
Look, Nigel, thanks, and definitely look forward to seeing you again in person. Always appreciate your support. I know you get tons of requests to do this, and I consider it very much a personal favorite. It's great. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, great to be here, Drew. And I'm sorry I couldn't attend more of the sessions.
No, well, next time we'll do it again.
Thanks.